Good afternoon. This is Bernard Green, Chair of the Select Board, and this is a meeting of the Town School Partnership for May 29th, 2020. We have an agenda that starts off with updates from the Select Board, School Committee, and Advisory Committee on the main topic of today's meeting, which is the budget that will be presented next week to the Select Board and that the Advisory Committee will take up for fiscal year 2020. This will be a tentative budget in that if things change for the better or the worse by November, town meeting will be in a position to make the necessary adjustments. So I don't think anyone should freak out over what's going to be in this budget. We have another bite at this apple. Start off with the report from the Select Board. We had a fairly good discussion of budget ideas that we shared with the town administrator at our meeting on May 26th. We talked about parking meter rates and basically indicated our agreement or approval of raising the rates by 25% so that in most areas there's special pricing around Fenway, but in most areas, there'll be either an increase of 25 cents from 75 cents to $1 per hour, and in business districts from $1.25 an hour to $1.50 an hour. Our approval or our indication of support for this does not mean that it goes into effect. Rather, the Transportation Board must take formal action by voting on it, and then the Select Board would approve it before it goes into effect. I assume that will happen very shortly. There was some discussion of demand pricing or variable rate pricing. That is an issue that we will probably continue to discuss. It does have significant or possibly significant capital expenditure implications, so that has to be balanced between the needs to reduce capital expenditures and the needs to make those changes if we think that it's important. We did indicate our support to returning to enforcement of the overnight parking ban and the enforcement of meters in town, which is basically the police starting to enforce them. There is some blowback from the community about that. And in my opinion, I think we should at least discuss whether we return to enforcing those June 1st or at some later date, probably July 1st, which is the beginning of the next fiscal year, which is when we need the money. There was discussion of whether we should save pedestrian and bike upgrade expenditures from our cuts. I think other members of the board said everything has to be on the table. We talked about free cash in a number of areas. For example, transferring or using money that's going into the stabilization fund to the reserve fund so that there's more flexibility with respect to its use. We discussed whether the OPEB payment of $4.4 million, which is scheduled to be increased by $250,000, should be made in whole, or whether just the increase should be eliminated. No decisions, or the board's positions, I think, could be characterized as favorable to the idea of not increasing that payment by $250,000. There may have been some disagreement as to whether the basic $4.4 million should be reduced or maintained as is. Let's see. There was some discussion of not making the, I think it's $2 million or so payment into under the special category in the free cash policy. Some discussion of not making that payment to the CIP and rather use that for operating expenses. Let's see. I think those are the things that I recall from our discussion. It was a good discussion, and we're going to see how many of our ideas were incorporated into the budget, and we'll discuss them further. Thank you.
Bernard, if I can just put some context around that.
Sure.
This group has heard previously that we're anticipating a revenue shortfall of between $6 million and $19 million in the upcoming fiscal year. So what Bernard spoke about was a lot of efforts that the select board is taking to try and mute or reduce the size of that anticipated revenue shortfall. And that's what his comments around restarting enforcement of the 2-hour parking limit and increasing of parking meter rates was in regards to. And then the second set of Bernard's comments were really aimed at trying to figure out how we're going to develop an FY21 budget and where reductions are going to need to be made. And his comments about capital improvement reduction and other efforts around moving monies around for our long-term obligations, OPEB in particular. That's what that was all related to. Just for folks who may be attending or watching on Big that didn't follow the specifics of that conversation by Bernard.
Thank you. And you did mention that I've actually failed to mention that in addition to enforcing the overnight parking ban and the meter payments, a requirement that you pay into the meter, we did discuss enforcing the 2-hour during the day ban, which is another piece of that. Thank you. Mr. Sandman, are you in a position to make or tell us what the advisory committee has been doing?
So we've had two discussions on the advisory committee, one on Tuesday night and the other last night. And last night we came up with, we did not vote on this, we didn't have a formal vote, but we had a pretty good consensus in terms of the discussion. And the recommendations that come out of that are hopefully specific enough for Mel and Melissa to take action on. On OPEBs, we felt like that was that $4.4 million, never mind the $250,000, was something that could be delayed and put off for a year so that those funds could be available. In terms of the stabilization fund, the only question that we had was raised was, what's the effect of not paying into the stabilization fund bond rating? Would it be sensible to make some sort of contribution to the stabilization fund? But the general sentiment, I think, was to use at least a substantial part of all of that $2 million to put into reserves and or reduce the gap, the budget gap. We talked about capital projects. There were a few CIP projects that we recognize are not connected to public safety and public
Excuse
health.
me, Mike. Could you speak more into your mic?
Sure.
Yeah.
Sorry. Is that better?
Yes, much better.
Okay. There were a few. We recognize that there were a few CIP projects that were not connected to public safety and public health, but the ones that are connected, we feel should go forward. We did not discuss the pedestrian and bike improvements specifically. I will tell you my personal view is that those are public safety improvements, but there are other public safety improvements that are in the CIP, and we should, generally speaking, be looking very carefully to make sure that we don't chop anything out of that costs us something. We talked about the trade-off between protecting jobs and capital projects, and we hope that the town and the schools can have a conversation with employees through their unions to emphasize that some sort of compromise would protect jobs, and we're hoping that that will happen. We recognize the time is short for that, and that it's a difficult conversation to have. We would love to see a change in the contribution to the town's contribution to benefits as a way to reduce costs and protect jobs, and that would in effect protect jobs at the same time. I believe that those are the main points that we covered. I'm actually looking at draft minutes to make sure that I've got that. We would very much urge you to put additional funds into from whether it's from OPEB or the state or not making a contribution to the stabilization fund into a reserve fund that the advisory committee can access. We are now down to $800,000 of remaining funds from a little over $2 million. We have at least one COVID-19 related reserve fund transfer request coming from the town, and probably one from the schools as well. And if we look at the likely impact of COVID-19 on fiscal 21, we think that we're going to need more funds than typically been provided.
Thank you. Is Julie on the in the meeting?
Yes, Bernard, I'm here. Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you very well.
Okay, great. So we have, as of this morning, the Finance Subcommittee asked and authorized me and Suzanne Federspiel as the chair and vice chair to send out a communication to the community about the reduction in force and layoff letters that we're sending out, the public schools of Brookline are sending out today. And that communication, we drafted that communication and it just went out a few moments ago. And so I think the best way to get everyone up to speed as to where we are would be for me to read that correspondence, if that's okay with you, Bernard.
Sure.
Okay.
So it had not gone out when the emails started to hit our boxes last night.
It had not. We had the decisions were made late at the school committee meeting that ended at about 12:30 on Wednesday night, and the superintendent had asked for time to be able to contact the supervisors of those individuals who would be impacted by the reduction of force and to be able to communicate and have time to communicate the message directly to those who would be most impacted before a letter went to the community about reductions in force that might be coming. So now that those notices have been sent to the individuals who will be impacted, the school committee is in a position to be able to send out a communication to a broader group. So that's why we didn't send a communication earlier, but we are prepared to do so now.
Julie, I'm sorry. I just want to make sure we're accurate here because I know the community cares a lot. Today, supervisors are speaking directly to those impacted, and later this afternoon, they will get the official letters. And speaking with supervisors, folks wanted to have personal conversations with folks affected before they got the official letter. We did tell supervisors yesterday about the specific notices, and that's when, and then it trickled out into the public as these things do, as people, and they started making phone calls last night. And that's and that just happens, So as the word got out and people were having conversations with those affected, so that's all. But the official notice to go out later today.
Okay. So the reduction in force notice that you're required to send by state law, I believe, has not gone out yet. That'll go out later on.
This afternoon at around 5 o'clock. So okay, that gives supervisors a chance to have the personal conversations as quickly as they possibly can with those affected.
Thank you.
Okay. Dear Brookline school community, we are writing today to share with you information that concerns our whole school community. During the COVID-19 induced budget crisis in the town of Brookline and due to the COVID-19 induced budget crisis in the town of Brookline and our contractual obligations with the Brookline Educators Union to provide notices of layoff by May 30th. The public schools of Brookline has no choice but to provide layoff notices to some of our valued teachers and staff. We know that each notice represents an individual or family's financial security thrown into question, and we know the worry and fear that these notices are creating for our educators, staff, and families. The COVID-19 pandemic has had a significant impact on the revenues and budget of the town of Brookline. Restaurant taxes have declined, parking meters have been suspended, and commercial revenue to the town of Brookline has fallen precipitously since March. The impact of the town's fiscal year 2021 budget is projected to be a gap of $12.8 million. On Friday, May 15th, the Brookline School Committee was notified at a public town school partnership meeting that the public schools of Brookline should plan to reduce its budget for FY 2021 year by $6,300,000. This is a 5.3% reduction from the budget that the school committee had previously voted for FY 2021, for which the school committee had planned to seek funding from town meeting this spring. The $6.3 million reduction means that the PSB will have less funding for schools in FY 2021 than it had in FY 2020. The town has made and will also continue to make cuts as well. The school committee is required to present a proposed budget to the town's advisory committee before town meeting and to seek appropriation of the proposed budget at the annual town meeting on June 23rd, 2020. Over the past 2 weeks, the PSB administration and the school committee have worked closely together to identify ways to close this budget deficit under these extraordinary conditions. At present, we do not have clear direction or guidance regarding whether school buildings will reopen in the fall or what those conditions may require in terms of staffing, supplies and materials, and services. We have had less than 14 days to identify reductions to our budget for next year. We believe that we may be able to address many of these questions prior to the start of the next academic year, but we need more time to put a high-quality educational plan into place that will ensure the health and safety of all of our students and staff. This is the progress that we've made thus far in proposed budget reductions that are not related to faculty. More than $1.5 million at central administration and district-wide leadership, $1.37 million in reductions to services and other budgets, and $31,000 in capital reductions. Because 86.8% of our total budget is personnel costs, it is impossible to make $6.3 million in reductions that do not impact our staff. There are many other paths forward that are being considered and implemented by districts across the state and country facing a similar financial crisis as a result of COVID-19. These include, but are not limited to, funding from the state and federal government, an override, pay cuts across the district, freezing steps and lanes, and furloughs. Many of these paths require negotiation and agreement from unions. Furthermore, the Brookline School Committee is committed to continuing to work on all pathways to achieve additional funds to support our budget needs. We are aggressively seeking additional funds from all levels of the government, including state and federal funds. We are vigorously advocating to the town of Brookline to increase the allocation that we receive from town revenues. The Brookline School Committee looks forward to having productive conversations with the town, representing our administrators, faculty, and staff about ways that we can partner together to decrease the impact of budget cuts on our staff. The committee is committed to maintaining as many of our employees to the greatest extent possible. The accelerated pace of this process has created challenges. We are saddened and disappointed at finding our district in this situation, and we are doing all we can to bring the district through a difficult time. We also regret that rumors and misinformation are circulating that are causing fear and anxiety to our families, educators, and community members. Here are the facts. The budget process is ongoing and no programs have been cut. BEEP has not been eliminated. Music, arts, library, health, and world language have not been eliminated. The PSB will continue to meet its obligations to our students with special needs and our English language learners. We are committed to our educators and staff, and we are doing all we can to find a path forward under these difficult circumstances. We are also committed to a transparent public process and invite all of our school committee members to participate in a public meeting on June 4th at 6 p.m. on the school budget. Information about how to participate in the meeting will be posted on our meeting calendar. To all of those who receive a layoff notice today, please know that we value your service, dedication, and tremendous spirit. We value your role in the life of our community. We are deeply saddened that we had to provide these layoff notices today. It is our deep hope that this measure is temporary, and we hope we will be able to recall our staff and be back at full capacity by the start of next school year. And it's signed by myself and by Suzanne Federspiel as well.
Thank you. So let's get into the exciting part of this meeting. Mr. Kleckner.
Sure. Melissa, could you pull up the slide deck with the first slide of the agenda sheet?
Bernard, while Mel is doing that, I just wanted to clarify in the opening comments you had asked about the notice deadline, the May 30th deadline. That is a contractual date. It's not a state requirement. I just wanted to provide that clarification.
What is the state requirement?
I believe it's June 15th.
Thank you.
Yes. Our original deadline was actually May 15th, but we did request and were granted an extension till May 15th from the BEU.
Thanks for the clarification, Julie. I just wanted to run through the agenda and what our expectations are today. We've heard the updates. They were very helpful. And by the way, have been very helpful to me and Melissa as we've begun to address at least this preliminary budget. And so the big matter is number 2, which really talks about how the budget is being developed, heading towards next Tuesday's release, and how it impacts town and schools. I did want to confirm or clarify what Bernard said about this being an initial budget, and I think Julie's comments and the letter to that the school committee has released really makes that point pretty well, and that is we do not have a lot of information and we do not have a lot of time, and that's not the best way to develop a long-term budget. And by the way, I do believe this is a multi-year budget issue that the COVID-19 and the economic crisis has created. It's not just a 1 year. So especially with a community like Brookline, which really uses a lot of public participation and collaboration in its budget process, I don't think we should expect that June 23rd is the end of this process. In fact, I think it's just the beginning of the process. And I see November, our regularly scheduled town meeting in November, as the time when we will make final changes to this budget that will be based on a lot more information, hopefully, and hopefully better information. I'm thinking particularly with federal funding. That's my hope. And that, but definitely that the public, through the advisory committee, the select board, the school committee, will have a lot more information and information to which to have a vigorous public dialogue, because as already has been mentioned, there's a lot of reductions here and expenditures that that we need to consider and balance with other potential options. So why don't I get right into the presentation? So next slide, please, Melissa. Select Board Member Green mentioned that the Select Board had a productive evening talking about revenue. So as you may recall, we had initially proposed in the FY21 budget that parking meter rates would go up. And in fact, we made that commitment really as part of our 3rd year of the override, which is fiscal 21, where we were going to raise a certain amount of non-property tax revenue to meet our commitment to the voters who raised property taxes for over this 3-year period. We were concerned after COVID-19 about increasing general rates, fees and rates, but the select board had a very productive discussion, and you can follow it yourself. But basically, the result of that discussion the other evening was that we have increased our revenue projection by $550,000, and we did it through we added $300,000 to parking meter rates. Now, it is true that a full year's worth of 25-cent parking meter rate is $750,000, but we believe that, consistent with our other revenue projections in our scenarios, that this is not a normal year. Fiscal 21 will continue to represent lower parking in general and parking compliance. So we brought that $750,000 worth of additional revenue down to $300,000, but at least it's more than what we had last week. And then we've also made an additional projection, a little bit more aggressive projection on cannabis excise taxes. So we are very concerned about cannabis excise taxes first, even before COVID, when the vaping crisis happened, and then again during COVID-19. But Sales are back. They will be back for July, and we believe pretty strongly that we'll have a second dispensary open in July, the sanctuary facility in Coolidge Corner. So we've been able to increase that revenue projection by 250. So bottom line, we've increased our revenue by $550,000. Not a lot, but at least it's a little bit to help. Next slide. But this is really where the meat of this meeting is. So I really want to tell you what I've done to the budget at this point, what I'm likely to present next Tuesday evening, and based on all the input I've received so far, and happy to receive more today, obviously. But my first point is I did want to reiterate one more time that this is a first step of a two-part plan to adopt the 21 budget. And it's unfortunate that the school committee is required to, give such advance notice, but it is, and so that's out there. But I think, as was mentioned in the letter that Julie read, there's a lot more information, a lot more consideration to be had, and I think we also have to look forward to FY22 because many of the decisions I've made today, and I'll go over with you, are taking into consideration that FY22 could possibly be worse than FY21. And we don't want to use all of our options in 1 year. So I guess the bottom line for everybody to know is that we've been able through many of these things we're going to talk about is reduce the shortfall that is impacting departments, the operating budget departments, by $3.75 million. So last week we were talking about a number that would impact school and town departments that was $3.75 million higher. So we're pleased about that. I already mentioned the modest increase in revenue projection. So where did the $3.75 million come from? Well, I think the biggest theme I want to address today, and which I'll be talking about next Tuesday, is that this crisis that's created requires people. It requires services, and not necessarily capital expenses, although I hate to reduce our capital expenses because we've done such a good job in keeping them up and dealing with the school enrollment crisis. But when it's a question of whether we're going to reduce staff or we're going to reduce capital expenditures, that was an easy decision for me. What I found in this crisis is that people need help. They need personal help. There's a lot of vulnerable populations, and I really want to, like the schools, avoid reductions in personnel if we can avoid them. So basically, what we've done here is we've reduced the CIP, the Capital Improvement Plan, by $3.5 million, and that decision has essentially freed up budget capacity to go back into the operating budgets, and so that's where that $3.75 million comes from. And I'm going to get into the slide, which shows this a little bit in just a moment, but I did want to address free cash because that was discussed a lot in the updates or reserves. So I am not, other than the capital, which, capital will be spending a lot of money towards free cash like it always does. But other than that, I am not looking at the free cash or reserves to cover an operating budget hole for fiscal 21. And basically that's because of the multi-year nature of this problem. To the extent that we use one-time sources and reserves to fill our operating budget hole, it just creates more problems down the road. And I'm not prepared to do that at this point. Maybe in FY22, when we see the nature of this problem, or if we see where federal funding is going to come or not, we can make decisions, different decisions in FY22. But at this point, I am not using free cash or reserves to cover the budget hole other than the CIP issue. So what we've done with the CIP basically is we've reduced the town's property tax funding for the CIP significantly. Although we continue to spend as much money, we're still spending 7.5% of our prior year net revenue for capital. But as Mike mentioned, with the capital budgets, the subcommittee of the advisory committee, we've looked at very hard at capital projects, including the school department, school capacity fund, and we made major cuts there. So that's really the story of this budget. That's how we were able to create $3.75 million in additional capacity to allocate to the operating budgets. Finally, I just want to mention that there are some budget policy changes. They're not state law changes. They're just internal Brookline-based budget policies that I will talk about shortly that we're going to have to amend. The select board are the ones who adopt these budget policy changes, and we're recommending some temporary changes that would accommodate this budget. Let's go to the next slide. So this is the slide. This is sort of the slide. I'm sorry, it's a little small, but it's the slide that we've been going over the last few weeks that kind of put it all together. And I think the most important thing you need to look at is our deficit, our shortfall went down from about 12.7 million to about 12.159 million. And that was basically those revenue issues we dealt with. And then how did we modify the operating budget? So you'll see that the operating budget shortfall has been reduced for both the town and school department. So right now, the amount of money that the budget will have to be reduced for town is now at $3.3 million, which is roughly about a 4.1% reduction from the prior budget, the prior fiscal 21 budget that we proposed on February 15th. And the schools is going down from there by 4.362 million, or 3.5% reduction. So a little better news that I'm prepared to announce on Tuesday, but love to get questions and comments about this. Is there another slide, Melissa, that we have? Okay, just to look at free cash again. This is our so-called free cash waterfall. So we still have 14.3 or almost $14.4 million of free cash. That's not going to change. That's a number. And really, what I'm doing, I'm really not making any changes to this proposal, other than you'll see number 4 and number 6, capital improvements and special use additional CIP. You'll find those numbers changing now, but there really is no other changes in the free cash that I'm proposing. I am at this point looking to put $2 million in the stabilization fund, but I hear what you're saying, Mike, and we'd be willing to consider taking some of that or from somewhere else and putting it in the operating budget reserve fund that's under the jurisdiction of the advisory committee. But I will say that you only get credit from Moody's when you put it in the stabilization fund. And I think that was BFAC's comment there. So even if you're using it for reserves, unless it's in the stabilization fund or in free cash, it doesn't count towards your 10% of fund balance. So now what it takes to get money out of the stabilization fund is a 2/3 vote of our town meeting. I don't think really that's that huge of a hurdle in tough times, but I understand what you're saying, Mike, and we would reconsider that if the advisory committee felt strongly about it. The only other thing I would say about this slide is under number 5, Affordable Housing Trust, $726,000 going into that fund. I think we ought to defer it or have some discussions with the Affordable Housing Advisory Committee to see if they really need that money now. I think it just creates a little bit more flexibility if we don't add it to the Affordable Housing Trust Fund at this time. They still have millions of dollars in their trust fund. This is just the formula to get it above $5 million. So that's the final slide I wanted to talk about. Why don't you go back to the earlier slide, Melissa, and then we can generate questions and discussions. Thank you.
Okay, any discussion?
Just the obvious one, Mel, as I said, when we talked about the stabilization fund, the advisory committee, there was a recognition that putting something in would be beneficial from the rating agency's perspective. The question is whether we have to take that whole $2 million bite. And if we had had a vote, we did not have a vote, but it probably would have been 2/3 to take the entire amount. But certainly a substantial majority would take a very substantial majority would take a chunk of it.
Understood.
Sorry, there's one other thing that I did not mention, which is the rental agreements that we have, which is a school issue. And I don't know whether this is the appropriate place to discuss those, but we felt like it was sensible to go back to the lessors, in this case the Temples and Maimonides School, and say to them that this is a very difficult time, that we would like to have some consideration from them with regard to the leases, and that, by the way, they don't provide us with pilot agreements. We have pilot agreements with them, and that, at least take a negotiating position with them from as strong a position as we possibly can, recognizing that we have signed leases and the obligations that we have.
I'm going to address thank you, Mike. I'm going to address a comment I saw. It asked about, followed up on that comment I made about the Housing Trust Fund. And so we haven't made any decisions yet, and it really isn't reflected in this budget slide. But my concern about the town's fund balance is that as we start to make more aggressive budget projections and there's less money in the budget, we're going to start generating less fund balance. We've had some very strong years of free cash, and I don't believe we're going to see those kind of similar performance over the next couple of years. So I'm just trying to hedge my bet a little bit and try to keep as much money in free cash until we need it. And then we could make that transfer into the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. It's sort of an ongoing trust fund. It's not as if it ends on a specific date of the year. I believe it continues to go forward. So it's really, I'm really looking at it more of a timing issue than anything else.
I would just add to that comment that, one of the other things that we're concerned about is the projected deficit on the school side and our ability to manage that deficit and close fiscal 20 with, in a surplus position.
Okay, any more questions?
Just a clarification for Mel that you're also holding out any decision about extending the full funding of the pension obligation until a future fiscal year. That's not something that you're including in the FY21 budget that you're going to present on Tuesday.
That's correct. Thank you for reminding me, Ben. I think that's an important discussion. And I believe the board did have some discussion about that. So for pension, as opposed to OPEB, let me talk about both of those. So as opposed to the OPEB, pension is an actual funding schedule. It's developed in an actuarial basis. PARAC, which is the state agency that controls retirement issues for cities and towns, has adopted that. It's really too late to make different assumptions that would impact fiscal 21. But I have talked to the retirement board. I believe Gina's on the line. She's a member of the retirement board, and they are going to be modeling different assumptions and techniques that actuaries use to refer, they call smoothing out or maybe extending a little bit the pain. And so I'm looking at it as an FY22 issue. I think there's practical issues to even if we wanted to do it for 21. Now on OPEB, I will admit that we do not have a formal funding plan for OPEB yet. It's such a big number. We're just not there yet, although we continually try to put money into that to address that unfunded liability. We have a special trust fund for that. And I think it's been mentioned, we put in about $4 million a year roughly, and then we increase it every year by an increment by 250,000. And I believe that's in our policies. And what I'm suggesting is that we don't increase the 250,000, that we hold off on that this year. But I am not proposing that we actually not put our normal amount that we've been paying into the OPEB trust fund, even though it's not required by law or it's not a formal actuarially funding plan. But I think I said before, I see this as the town's credit card, and I think we continue to need to pay that off, and at least hold off changing that until next year when we see where things are at.
Okay, well, I made the comment from the advisory committee that we would like to see some very substantial part of that reduced. I accept the point that we may have to look at this next year. I think it's really important to remember that that number can't be sacred if we have another year like we have.
So
Any comments from the school committee? Or questions?
I'm happy to say something, but I think Cliff is going to say something.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a couple of points. I probably was I would be one of the people who would not agree with the 2/3 majority on advisories as it relates to the stabilization fund, really for a couple of reasons. One of which Mel has so fully explained. The other of which is that to take money and to put it into a fund that the advisory committee controls over and above what the advisory committee normally gets doesn't do anything for the budget whole. It's just moving money around. And to the extent that, we needed extra reserves to deal with, additional shortfalls, if you will, emergencies, that is something that ultimately, if we have to tap into our reserves, our rainy day funds through the town meeting mechanism, we can do that. But just moving it from stabilization over to advisory does nothing for the gap that we're talking about. The other thing I want to mention, and I know I'm a broken record on this, but I think it's really important for everyone on this call to appreciate, as well as in the public. And that is that when you look at what this revised budget says versus the fiscal 20 budget, you can see that we are essentially flat funded, okay? We're not cutting based upon what we've just experienced this past fiscal year. And in fact, in some places, we're having slight increases. And I think that it's a different way of looking at this. And I think is an appropriate way of looking at it, because people have to see that, we're essentially no different than we were on July 1st, going to be different than we were for the year before that. I think that that's really important for people to appreciate.
Could you elaborate on that? Maybe I'm dense. I didn't really get that.
If you look at the budget here, fiscal 20, $117 million over year, fiscal 21, $119 million. That's flat funding. Right? The cuts that you see are against the original fiscal 21 budget. So if we had said to people back in February, we're going to have a flat funded budget for fiscal 21, I personally think that the reaction that we would be having and what we would be dealing with emotionally for people would be frankly quite different.
Okay, I believe Susan was about to speak for the school committee. Not for the school committee, but ask some questions.
Yeah. No. So first of all, I appreciate the update, Mel, and absolutely appreciate the budget changes that you've made and the adjustments. I think one thing I just want to acknowledge is that this is a really hard day in Brookline. This is a community. We support our schools, we support our teachers, and this is a really tough day. So I appreciate this. I don't want to let that go. I also think that it's very hard for people who are kind of following this budget process to see swings of millions of dollars each way. And I think the answer is that's just the reality of how this works. But I think it's a little bit disorienting to people who are trying to find it. So I'm just acknowledging that sort of experience of this as well. So let me just say a couple things, and I don't want to repeat anything that Julie said. I mean, clearly we've heard about some pretty difficult reduction in force decisions, and we've heard that, I'm not going to repeat it, but we are taking many other actions to try to squeeze blood out of stone. So not only are the RIF actions happening, but as Julie said, more than $1.5 million in central office reductions and more than that in other expense reductions. There was a mid-year expense freeze, so we're trying to harvest $2 million of avoided costs in this current year because we're not in the buildings to kind of hold on to those. Mary Ellen is pulling a lot of money from all sorts of different expense lines that haven't gotten expensed, so we're just kind of scraping a lot of barrels to see if we can kind of pull money from there. And even things that you've heard of before, like the bus contract conversation is, still a live conversation. And we're pretty aggressively pursuing reimbursement on a whole bunch of levels for COVID-related expenses, from FEMA to MEMA to CARES Act and whatnot. So there's a lot going on right now to try to mitigate these numbers as much as possible, and to scrape a lot of barrels. The last thing I will say is that we will probably still need. We were talking about this morning at the finance subcommittee. We'll probably still need a pretty substantial reserve fund transfer, and we're cognizant that there are many calls on that, and that is not an unlimited pot either. But even just for this current year, I think we're projecting something in the range of $700,000. That is not a final number. Not a final number until Mary Ellen emails it to us, I guess. But as a result of unexpected costs this current year, so the fact that BEEP, we are continuing to pay teachers and we're not charging BEEP families tuition, food services, custodians, all the things we've talked about before. So again, the first thing we're trying to do is go after a lot of those, moving the accounting over so we can leverage as much federal money as possible or state money, but then there's still going to be a gap even for this year. So happy to answer questions on any of that. We probably have finance subcommittees twice a week at this point. So you're all welcome to come. Thank you to the advisory committee members who do regularly come. And yeah, I just want people to know that this is a very detailed and extensive analytic effort to try to pull this down at every single level.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments?
So if there's nothing else on this, I think I just want to re-up the conversation about reopening the schools. I think it's just important as we get clearer about the kinds of things that might be required to open schools, including testing, masks, dividers, all sorts of, there's so many expenses that come along with it. I'm sure many of you read the popular press and what's happening in other towns. The school committee is putting together a set of expert advisory panels with really incredible community members who live here in Brookline, who are going to help us think about this, and that the staff can use as a resource to think about reopening the schools. But just for the purpose, so happy to have that conversation, but just for the purposes of this, there are going to be a tremendous number of expenses that are not anywhere in this presentation or on this radar screen. So I just need to keep saying that, and I don't know where the right place for that to live is, but it's either the COVID task force, the town COVID task force, because it needs to be a partnership with town and schools. If the school shut down for 2 weeks, that's a town problem. It's not just the school's problem. Like we just need to be kind of good partners in that. So it could just be helpful to understand from a governance perspective what the right way to think about that question is, and budget for it. And I know there are people on the advisory committee who have thoughts here as well, but I don't want to let that one go because it's because we didn't talk about it.
I'd like to just address it briefly, and that is that so we have not included federal funding in the operating budget, but we have up to $5.2 million, at least at this point, that's been allocated to the town. That's big town, that includes school department, for any unbudgeted COVID directly related COVID expenses. So things like testing and cleaning and all those things are part of our plan. And we have to put in at least a fiscal 20 version of that grant by June 5th. And as far as I know, we're working very closely with the school department in that.
Yes, very closely, very hard. Thank you, Mel. Yes.
And the fiscal 21 number, I don't know when the deadline for submitting that is, but I think the point is if you have COVID direct related expenses, don't put them in the budget, because once you put them in the budget, they're no longer eligible for funding for CARES or other federal funding. So we should coordinate that. I believe we are, but I think we need to be more clear about that. So,
and they're not in the budget for exactly the reasons you said. So absolutely.
So one thing I want to ask about is the role of the town's health department in the planning that you're doing for reopening the schools. To what extent have you been able to involve the health department, and to what extent are you getting cooperation?
This is Ben. We're getting tremendous cooperation from the town's health department on things that are immediately happening now, graduation plans at the 8th grade, also the high school. So things that are very important like that are in the immediate term. But also work as part of the COVID task force, the townwide task force, keeping very much in the loop through operations, and also our head of nursing, and we'll also continue to, on two levels. One, work directly with the health department, but as Ms. Dickoff said, have additional experts in the field helping with our planning. So so far, the health department and Dr. Jett have been incredible partners, very responsive, very quick to support, very quick to answer our questions. So it's been going very well.
Okay, thank you.
Just a clarification on the task force. So the task force is truly a sort of combined town and school. It's a staff-driven process, and that, as you remember, it was first created when we had to make quick decisions, and I really couldn't even wait for 48-hour notice for board meetings. But since that time, the task force defers policy level discussions to the elected board. So every week, for example, the select board has on their agenda items that they want to talk about related to COVID. And so the task force provides information, but ultimately the bottom line decisions, those policy decisions, will continue to be made by the elected boards.
Mel, I just wanted, Cliff had said something earlier about level funding, and I think that there is one of the notes that someone has made in the comments box reminds me that we've talked about this before at Town School Partnership, but some confusion does come up about this in the community and in the conversation. When you have a level funded budget, it does mean that the same amount of money is transferring from one year to the other. But the reason that we would still have to consider cuts, even with level funding, is because we have mandatory and required increases that happen from one year to the next. So for example, we would have increase in busing expenses if busing does take place next year. We would have increase in special education costs, out of district tuition costs. And then we have contractually required pay increases, such as steps and lanes in our contracts with the BEU that would take effect. And so if we maintain at the same level that we are at, we have mandatory and required increases that go along with that as we progress to the next year. And so without having changes to the contractual obligations and other cuts, being level funded does not mean everything stays and that we don't have to make any reductions.
We understand that cost-wise.
I just wanted, and I know that we talked about it last week and the week before as well, but because it was raised as a point, I just wanted to make sure that those watching who might be tuning in for the first time have that context.
Great, thank you. Any further questions, or should we move on to the next topic?
Well, the next slide, Rich, is really just the final slide and talks about next steps, and there's really nothing else on there, but I think it's a good wrap-up slide. So just so everybody
Well,
knows,
the agenda has discussion of school revenue allocation formula. Do we want to say?
well, I think it's in, okay, good point. That is embedded in that prior slide. So just to remind everybody that there's, two parts of this exercise. One is just to, project the revenues. And then it's the question of how do you allocate those revenues fairly and equitably in this town budget process. And that implicates the so-called town school partnership formula, which has been the subject of much discussion at BFAC. And I think the bottom line where the town school partnership formula is in transition. And I think for this purpose, we're kind of throwing it out and just figuring out where was the relative percentages of the budget fixed when we submitted our budget back in February 15th. And we've committed to sort of retain those same relative percentages of the budget. So it's no longer the so-called 50-50 split that we often talk about the town school partnership. It's really, at least for this year, it's just setting the same relative pie of the parts of the pie that we proposed in fiscal 21 back in February. And I don't recall those specific percentage allocations. Melissa, I don't know if you have those.
I would just add to the comments that you made, Mel, that for the new items that are on the sheet, the OPEB savings, the savings is distributed town and school based on the percentage of OPEBs that ran through the original split. So I believe that was a 56% allocation to the schools, and then the balance would go to the town. And then for the CIP, the $3.5 million, any CIP allocation gets divided 50-50 town and school, so that the savings got distributed in that same way as well.
Great.
All right. So, yeah.
The 50-50 has been a fiction for a long time, and I think I can speak for other members of the advisory committee in saying that splitting based on the actual allocation that was in the FY20 budget or the original FY21 budget makes perfect sense.
So we can continue to talk about that as we go forward, but I think everybody understands that we have not changed that position in the last few weeks. We continue to feel that we're going to just keep the same relative percentages in the earlier budget in this revised budget. So with that, really, I think that's the final issue. And then I just want to be clear to folks, on Tuesday, I will be presenting this budget in more detail. So we'll be talking more about the actual expenditure reductions we're proposing in the CIP and in municipal departments anyway. I can't speak for the schools, but obviously they will speak for themselves. And I think it's really important. That's why I think it's so important that we let people know that this is just the first step of a two-part process. It's really difficult with so many changes happening so quickly. And our ability to have public dialogue limited by our social distancing and remoteness, that we have to look at this as a November process. I think it makes no sense to consider that this is the budget and we're just going to tweak it in November. I think we're going to be looking at all the issues as we should for our budget process.
And we'll have a better sense of what this virus is doing to us economically as well as otherwise.
So as far as the school side process, we will be having a presentation of the interim superintendent's recommendations for the FY21 budget on Monday. And then this upcoming Thursday, as I mentioned at the beginning of the meeting, we will be having a public discussion on the budget as well. And that will be taking place on Thursday at 6 p.m.
Julie, we also have a finance committee meeting Wednesday morning, just because, that was the day that we didn't have a school committee meeting. And so assuming there may be further conversation between Monday and Thursday.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Anything else?
Nothing.
I guess that concludes the business of this meeting. So let's end. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all.